Now,
Thank you, Mehmet.
Schanz, and her title is In the Unspace, Transnational Armenian Feminist Dialogues Between Identities, Belongings, and Mother Tongues.
Okay, so in the interest of giving too much theory, and actually Baron Tologyan already gave a really great theoretical framework for what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about a collection of literary essays, and so I'm going to more exemplify this transnational fragmented identities that we've been talking about this morning. So, the laws try to make us disappear, silence and immobilize us, but we continue to draft in black, seva karel, excavate and experiment. Writes Shoshana Vagyan in an essay entitled Seva Menk, or Black Selves, the third and final piece in the multi-voiced publication In the Unspace, published in 2007, in an experimental collaboration of nonfiction essays written by three feminist Armenian authors, Nancy Agabyan, Lara Aharonyan, and Shoshana Vagyan. Written in French, English, and Eastern Armenian, each of its authors' native tongues, these feminists, coming from different languages, histories, and socio-political backgrounds, question their unbelonging to the Armenian identity. Critiquing obligatory motherhood, the oppression of women, and the absence of language to express women's sexuality and non-reproductive sexuality, the compilation, in a three-way dialogue across national borders and homes, seeks to open up the experience, the Armenian experience, to a greater plural expression. While the authors hail from several diasporic spaces, Lebanon and Canada, the United States, and post-Soviet Armenia, they nonetheless share a common narrative of alterity as feminists and queers, a space they conceptualize as the unspace, much like Homi Bhabha's third space, or what can only exist in the in-betweens. The authors conceptualize this space as their interspace, which I will address later. I came across In the Unspace in a small bookshop in Yerevan and decided to translate the Eastern Armenian essay by Shoshana Vagyan, excited that a feminist compilation existed by Armenian women. Later, I began to think critically about it in the greater context of situating it within a genealogy of contemporary queer and feminist Armenian women's writing. Before I speak about the three intersecting themes of language, motherhood, and mother tongue, and interspace in this text, and of course the text is not limited to just these three themes, I will first begin with a theoretical digression to contextualize the intellectual geographies the book spans and how it fits into the greater over of my research. So, while there has been a significant rise in the past decade in uncovering and translating 20th century Armenian women's writing, a lacuna remains in the scholarship on contemporary feminist literary production. As scholars like Victoria Rowe and Lerna Ekmekcioglu and Melissa Bilal, and translators like Shoshana Vagyan and Jennifer Manukyan, to name a few, are importantly uncovering the history of Armenian women seeking liberation from patriarchal structures, how can we relate, compare, and use it as inspiration in the present Armenian feminist struggle? Does the literature of contemporary Armenian feminist struggle even exist? If so, how might the notion of more progressive conservatism, as Ekmekcioglu characterizes of the Western or Turkish Armenian feminism born out of the Armenian national struggle of the early 20th century, how might that have shifted today? Alternately, how do Armenian feminisms in the Soviet and now post-Soviet context develop? Did or does it imbue similar nationalist discourse like its counterpart in post-genocide Istanbul? Are these struggles somehow, if juxtaposed, translatable, notwithstanding their distinct geopolitical contexts? What new layers, if any, has cross-cultural exchange added to contemporary feminist discussion? Expanding upon Tologyan's concept of diaspora as the exemplary communities of the transnational movement, literary critic Mirna Duzcan and anthropologist Nelly Sargsyan-Pittman argue that the entire Armenian transnation, both the post-Soviet republic and the diaspora together, are located at the interstices of cultures and identities across these geographic landscapes, so that the concept of homeland even needs to be dismantled, and we can also talk about it within that transnational context. So in short, the Armenian nation is transitive, in movement, unfixed geographically, linguistically, and culturally. Now, as contemporary feminists and queers in the transnation share their experience with their own cultural specificities, how do they find themselves through collaboration on various levels, deconstructing nationalism, or at least some of the tenets of nationalism, like language purity and its inheritance, patriarchy, heteroreproductivity, compulsory motherhood, and ethnic homogeneity that sustain it? So what kinds of discursive spaces also does this dialogic experiment tackle in order to talk about the disarticulation of these non-normative sexual and feminist identities? I'll skip this part here. And I'll also just make a note and say that the term even Armenian feminist and Armenian queer can be taken into question as a sort of paradoxical understanding of what we're talking about, as the concept of Armenian, and Lerna Ekmekcioglu also talks about this. The concept of Armenian is more categorizing the term in a national context, while the feminist and the queer is always trying to leave that nation, that home, that space. And of course, the problem that we can talk about in the transnational discourse that's happening, especially with Armenian queers in the past few years especially, is that these people are being labeled as the nation's and country's national enemies, people who are engaging in non-reproductive sexuality, people who are being written out of the experience by saying that these people don't exist. An example is Armenian queers or queer Armenians don't exist. They are Turks. Go back to Baku, all of these things. But anyway, it's a digression. So all to say that a work like In the Unspace, when we're kind of taking these women's voices from this transnational context, is very interesting. And what kinds of things are they actually talking about? How are they inserting language also that has been taken out of that experience for non-normative sexuality or feminist subjectivity? How are they reinserting it back into language? So here we go, into the unspace. So in her reflective essay on the trials of, I'm skipping all of this. No, okay. In her reflective essay on the trials of translation in the immediate wake of the fall of Yugoslavia, Susan Sontag, in Being Translated, extols as the potent fantasy about language as the carrier of national identity. Along with others, Sontag grabs here at one of the very cores of national identity construction, not only written along normative gender tropes as women as nation, men as the defenders of that nation, and women as the tradition bearers, but also language, its inheritance, its naturalization, and its use, as serving to both construct and unify identity discourse. Sontag talks about this purity, and that then considering translation as the interruption of that purity, and then as treason. So how does In the Unspace interact with this treason? The work is experimental and fragmented, and it bridges the gaps between diaspora, homeland, and languages, as its authors hail from the US, France, and post-Soviet Armenia. In each essay, the author takes up her own preoccupation about being a woman and being Armenian. Born in Beirut and a migrant to Canada, Lara Aharonyan pivots her piece, I dare say, around the story of her second expatriation from Canada to post-Soviet Armenia, and her encounter with severe domestic violence, which goes unchallenged in the country and is met with silence in the diaspora. Writing in French, Aharonyan perhaps best encapsulates the theme of gender trouble and sexual disenfranchisement of women, as she disfamiliarizes even the collocation Armenian woman, a mixture of nation and gender, to deconstruct it. So she writes, I am woman and Armenian. woman, Armenian, Armenian woman. This exercise to separate, juxtapose, and defamiliarize the concepts parallels Lahara's own self-exile from the Armenian family in Canada to become a stranger in an unfamiliar imagined homeland where she only shares the language. While she constantly expresses this loss of language because of defamiliarization in a strange place, she says things like, he speaks to me in sign language, so her loss of language completely. And she writes, I don't have a past or present. My female body is losing itself little by little, and the Armenian emerges to take refuge in a cold and frigid body whose sex doesn't breathe anymore. Her linguistic identities and transcultural mixité, threatened by Armenia's homogenization, as well as by the oppressive situation of women in Armenia, renders Lada's literally becoming an Armenian woman as the disactivation of her sexuality. My vagina is in a coma. Interestingly, one might question why, however, if she felt Armenian before her arrival to Armenia, she might only feel this vaginal coma now, but this is another topic. In an effort to counteract the reality Lada perceives in Armenia, as well as the unnaming and thus erasing of the vagina in the public sphere, she touches herself, this prohibited organ, untouchable, that doesn't have a name, using physicality to resummon into existence, in the absence of language, that which is lost, that which she could never imagine Mother Armenia possessing. As Nancy reminds us in her English piece, this acknowledgement of physicality is like Virginia Woolf's message for women to write herself as body, and certainly an echo of the L'écriture féminine movement to write the body. Lada goes as far as to visit a gynecologist during her months in Armenia because she doesn't feel anything in her vaginal stupor, and the doctor gestures, substituting for language, and remedies. Madzun kase, put Armenian yogurt, and it will pass. Certainly a humorous anecdote, Aharonian quickly brings her reader back to its gravity, paralleling the severe lack of language to the lack of conversation in Armenia about its contemporary socio-political struggles. Everything will pass in Armenia, the pain, the poverty, the corruption, a bit of yogurt, and the game's up. Noting the doctor's avoidance to name her sex and giving her a proper suggestion, Aharonian laments, he fears to put in danger the values of an old society that lives by parasitically feeding on the suffering of its dislodged population. The unnaming of female sexuality is then a problem for society. In interesting contrast, Nancy's English language text, The Experiment, the first essay in the collection, is written during her one-year sojourn in Yerevan as a writing teacher. So this essay focuses in part on language acquisition during her familiarization to Yerevan. Unlike Lada or Shushan, she doesn't speak Armenian, yet while her boyfriend Arman is teaching her dirty words in Armenian, the actual meaning of her grandmother's pet name for her as a child is revealed, Pupulik. I don't have an inkling as to why my grandmother called me a little penis. A good sense of humor? Maybe she was naming me something she couldn't name otherwise, she wonders. Writing her part diary, part conversation, Nancy, with a foreign gaze of Armenian society, agrees with Lada. At first I thought it was a language flitch, but now I realize you can't take for granted that all human beings are sexual the way you might somewhere else. Hiding can be the most significant element of one's sex life. Sexuality is denied and negated. In addition, she says women focus mostly on their appearance without worrying about the inside. Yet it would seem that Nancy, a bisexual queer Armenian, coming to Yerevan, might have metaphorically been predestined to break out of that dynamic through the queer naming by her grandmother. In one of the poems that she includes in the essay, The Answer, she writes, I will put my time and energy into writing emails, washing dishes, and touching my clit while having anal sex. How could any decent Armenian woman mention such topics? I'm going to skip to Shushan's piece here, but I'll just here mention that also a common theme throughout all of these essays is also not just the sexual frustrations that both Nancy and Lada are feeling while in Armenia because of the disarticulation of language about this topic. but also they attack Armenian motherhood and obligatory motherhood. Why should motherhood and sexuality be taken out of the experience of motherhood? And they talk also about their domineering Armenian mothers in this process. As they're talking about these domineering mothers, all authors start to agree that the only way, first of all, to be able to live in this space is to write, which is an echo to Shoshani Kurinyan's poem, I Want to Live, but also that they decide in a very Freudian sense that the Armenian woman doesn't have another choice. To remain alive, she must first kill her parents. And Nancy, in fact, decides that she's going to take this to the next level, also as a queer, someone who also is in the position to not have to be obliged to participate in the heteroreproductive normative. She says, I don't want to be a mother. I am kind and caring and giving enough as it is. I feel guilt and I cannot give up my life for a child. As noble as that may be, it's not natural for my nipples to be used for food. I'll just quickly finish with Shushan's text. I know I'm running out of time. Shushan's text is probably the most experimental and fragmented of all these three essays. And she kind of gives a better idea of the entire project. She talks about the idea of the interspace, and translation is also very important to her. And the idea that putting these three essays together, what happens with the message and what the message that's being portrayed is something that's found in between those spaces. So not anything that's going to be found reading just the English, the French, and the Armenian, but what's the message in the interstices of those texts. And just quickly about language. So Lara says, my parents say I'm Armenian. I'm trying to erase everything and create my own definitions. I speak Armenian. I think in French. Sometimes in Arabic. I write in French. I speak Armenian, but my emotions are not Armenian. And how to express them? I've been betrayed and a monster has been created. Apropos of the translation project and the interspace project that's going on, Shushan continues, and she longs to shirgel, this word that means both to invert and to roam. And she says it in the context of pushing the heteroreproductive norms also in Yerevan, and she says, I long to shirgel in Yerevan, walking freely arm in arm with a certain Sarah. So how might this queer the Yerevan that she knows? Transform, change your clothes, and get in drag. So it is important to read the three of us simultaneously, in 3 different languages, in 3 different voices, and in different rooms, writes Havak. It's important to grasp what it is that allows for the side-by-side existence of 3 radically different perspectives, how differences can create a unified whole. For Havak, these black selves, and she calls this process to sevakrel, how differences can create and unify the whole. So to write in black is the unity of the book's disunity. It's unity and hybridity of experience, language, and identity, a space that fills unspace, not a stagnant belonging, but a transitive fragment ever becoming. Transmitting through polylog is also an opportunity, according to Havak, for the individual's self-materialization, an exercise that 3 women across 3 diasporic spaces and inverted exiles in the transnation, across generations, legacies of womanhood, sexual orientations, and political persuasions, across vulnerabilities, resistances, and transformations, shares the new voice of the Armenian women's writing in the 21st century. Thank you.